Hi, my name is Sara Federman. I'm an assistant professor of negotiations and conflict management at the University of Baltimore. And I'm going to share with you a webinar that I did with Dr. Sara Cobb, and I'll tell you a bit about her in a second, called Changing Stories, Resolving Conflicts, Building Resilient Family Offices. This presentation today is going to help. Specifically, it's designed for family offices, but it can be used for any business or any organization that's looking to make long-term change. We're going to share with you, for this presentation, shares some of the most cutting-edge approaches in conflict resolution that not only address the conflict in the short term, but help you build long-term strategies and create a team environment that's adaptable and resilient, which has high stakeholder engagement, which everybody wants. And if you know business, you know conflict. It either keeps you up late at night or wakes you up early in the morning. And if you do family business, then you know there's no escape. It's pervasive. It's at the holiday dinner table, and it's on television. Whether you're looking at Game of Thrones, Bob's Burgers, Sons of Anarchy, Silicon Valley, Arrested Development, Empire, The Invincibles, and of course, The Godfather. The Godfather needed 3 movies because conflict in family business can take so long and can be so enduring through generations, not just pervasive throughout an organization. So we're going to talk about what makes great television makes for terrible reality, and how you can, through a narrative approach to conflict resolution, get yourselves out of a television drama and into a really resilient, healthy work environment that everyone is eager to come to in the morning. Just to tell you a little bit about us, so Dr. Sara Cobb, who's not here today, is the director of the Center for Narrative and Conflict Resolution at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. I studied under Sara as her doctoral student, and before I came to the doctorate, I spent 10 years as an advertising executive presenting at companies such as Google and Bloomberg, and traveling all over the world from working in Manhattan. I was based in Paris for a while, then meetings in Dubai and Sydney and Beijing and so on. So I've worked in businesses for a long time, and I grew up in a family business. And then did the Harvard Business Key Executive Program on negotiations and strategy and so on. So that's a little bit about us. We love narrative, and we're going to tell you why a narrative approach to conflict resolution is a great approach. The learning objectives of this webinar is just to give you a little bit of introduction to conflict resolution as a field. It means so many things today, and Dr. Cobb and I work on everything from interpersonal conflict on up to post-genocidal contexts or international warfare. So it really is broad, so we want to talk to you just a little bit about that. Learn the benefits of a narrative lens, and then how do you identify the attributes in your own organization of a healthy narrative space? How do you know if your organization is healthy, and how can you make it healthier if it's not? And what are some of the indicators of some disruption? So first, as I said, just a little introduction about conflict resolution. For many years, both negotiation and conflict resolution, both in the peacekeeping world and in the business world, treated conflict as something out there that needed to be considered. We were trying to get an outcome and change the external world. Today, it's become much more reflexive. And this move towards reflexivity, meaning looking at what's happening inside ourselves and getting to understand what's really important to us and how we see the world, is reflected in the business literature as well. Many of you probably are familiar with the very famous Getting to Yes. And you can see William Urey's latest book is called Getting to Yes with Yourself. The first book really talks about how you get more out there, how you can build value for everyone who's in the negotiation, all the different parties. But it's a lot about how you can get more of what's out there. And now William Urey is talking about kind of getting up on the balcony, imagining yourself on a stage and saying, well, what is it that I really want? What am I really up to in the world? What really means something to me? So in business terms, if you're negotiating for a job, you might think that salary is the most important thing. But when you look back, maybe it's going to be maternity or paternity leave or vacation or some flexibility in terms of working from home. So just to not go for the assumptions that more is more. There are many things on the table, many ways to create value, but it really requires knowing yourself to get into that. So we reflect, the approach that we do reflects that turn. But what Dr. Cobb and I do is we're not looking simply at within individuals, and that's really important work for individuals to figure out and organizations to figure out what they want. But we're looking at what's happening within an organization on a conversational level, so we can understand what's happening inside. So again, rather than just facing on what's happening with the competition, we have discovered that a lot of what hurts organizations most is themselves. A lot of internal battles, a lot of lack of trust, lack of stakeholder engagement, lack of adaptability, beliefs that a company's not good enough, distrust of suppliers, different internal teams not working together, maybe marketing and accounting are competing. So that's what we're really looking at, is how to make that internal space vibrant. And then you can adapt to the marketplace, handle the competition, and so on. So the agenda, I'm going to take you through 4 parts of this. The promises and pitfalls of conflict resolution generally, a case for a narrative lens, the risk assessment that we do, and then intervention. Okay, the promises and pitfalls of conflict resolution. Dr. Cobb and Dr. Allison Castell and I are working on a Conflict 101 textbook that takes you through like these 3 generations of conflict resolution. But just briefly now, the first generation of conflict resolution strategies included negotiation, rational choice, and alternative dispute resolution. So if you've done any business negotiation training, it's often of this first generation. And then in the second generation, you start to look at mediation and dialogue, really starting to get to know one another. It's not just enough to get a really good deal, to sign the agreement, but you want to build a relationship. You want to make sure there's a deeper understanding of one another for long-term success, for long-term relationships. And then what we do is we start to, in the third generation, is we're looking at something that's much more systemic, much more process-oriented, and focused on an evolution and development in relationships. And it's really looking at the long term. So the other first 2 generations are really looking at agreements. Even mediation and dialogue groups are looking to get an agreement that people can feel good about and then move forward with. But the work that we're really doing is transforming with organizations how they see themselves as individuals and one another, and how they see themselves vis-a-vis the competition and the marketplace and their larger role in society. So we're really looking long-term, which is a great fit for family businesses, since there's often that kind of intergenerational focus. But right now, there's so much focus for the C-suite to just deliver numbers and to move on. So that kind of 5-year plan, 10-year plan, 100-year plan is getting very shortened. So we're trying to really build that solid foundation for organizations. Now, why narratives matter is that what ends up happening is the stories that you hear in an organization, and we call them stories. It doesn't mean that they're not true. That's so we get away from true and false. But if you walk into any company and you listen to what people are saying about each other, the organization, the competition, those are what we call narratives, and sometimes for shorthand call stories. And they're a worldview. And then what ends up happening, they become the worldview that then ends up creating or perpetuating a particular situation. So for example, if I walk into a company and I hear, we just never win the big contracts. That's always the other guy. We only get the little contracts. There's a belief in there. And then what ends up happening, if that's the belief, that gets passed down to the sales team, to the service team, and so on. And so that perpetuates that situation, that no one really ever challenges that to go after the big fish to see if maybe some of the big clients do want to work with you. There could be a worldview that, the marketplace doesn't need our products anymore, and that's the problem. And then you can start to pull back and start to feel insecure rather than going forward. So what ends up happening is these stories, these beliefs that circulate in an organization start to create your reality rather than simply representing it. Now, the family offices that we've worked with have struggled with everything from succession planning, sibling rivalry, kind of mass levels of stakeholder disengagement, and then just conflicts over power and intergenerational issues. Now, if you email me, my email is at the bottom of these slides, so you can email me. We have information on a number of great case studies. So we have one involving future generations, resolving conflicts for future generations. This case study has to do there was a conflict across a number of owners within an organization, and this threatened to dissolve the company. And through this narrative work, able to hold the company together. This second case, Second Generation Unleashed, where the second generation was marginalized in the running of the business, and there was a power struggle over assets. The intervention was actually to have the second generation go start some of their own businesses, feel some of their own success and their own competence, and then they actually were brought back in leadership positions in the company. So that was a way that we worked with a second generation. The third was the story of the darling son. This was a situation in which the son had been favored by the father, and the mother and the daughter had been largely marginalized, even though the daughter was a very successful and highly intelligent businesswoman. The son, who was squandering the assets and not doing a lot great for the company, but had been kind of the darling child, was really privileged. So in this intervention, it was about creating space for both the daughter and the mother to come back in and work more as a team. So that was fascinating as well. So what do these cases demonstrate? And again, if you email me, we can give you some more of those. But they demonstrate in the end that conflict is not just about competition between people and values. It's not just about we're both going after the same thing. That conflict is really about divisions and fractures between one another, and I'll go into this in a minute, but how we see things in black and white. We attribute bad intent. We attribute character flaws. So I'll talk about this in a second, but it ends up becoming an us versus them, pushing people out, and what ends up happening is it creates a very polarized space that's very difficult to overcome and be resilient to the marketplace, because the fractures are so great within the company, the competition barely needs to do anything to knock you over. So what we do a risk assessment, and I want to talk to you a little bit about this risk assessment because I think it will help you just think through what's happening in your own organization. And we do a listening tour when we first enter an organization to get a sense of what the stories are, so we get a sense of how to do this. So the components of our risk assessment are the structural assessment, a power assessment, and then an overall landscape assessment. And what we're looking for in a healthy environment is, when we're doing the listening tour, is we're looking for plots meaning when people are talking about what's going on in the company, we're looking for complex stories. In a healthy environment, you're going to hear very complicated situations that have a long timeline, multiple characters, complex details, because that's a sign of kind of a robust understanding of something. In an environment that's less healthy, you're going to hear very thin plot lines, like we have no chance in the marketplace, the supplier can't be trusted, we can't keep up, the sales staff isn't engaged. Those are the kinds of, we can't trust people on timelines. Those kinds of things are very simple storylines that tend to show a lot of distrust within the organization. So one way to think of it shorthand is when you go into your organization, does it sound like a soap opera in terms of the drama? Does it feel very dramatic? There's a lot of us versus them. There's a lot of disbelief in one another, lack of trust. Or does it feel more like Dr. Zhivago? I don't know if you've all read the book or seen the movie, but in a story like Dr. Zhivago, what you have is not just conflicts that are happening, but conflicts embedded within cultural context. Multiple characters, shifting alliances, outside forces that are happening as well as inside forces. And that's a very different shape of a story than a melodrama. So it's just in terms of how you're listening to it. Does what you're hearing sound like, as our colleague Dr. Sam Hardy calls it, melodrama versus tragedy? So I'm going to talk more about that in another video, but just that's one of the things we're listening for and that you can listen for. So when you're listening to someone in your organization talk about a problem, you're trying to move them from the melodrama into the tragedy. The tragedy being, life is complicated. We make decisions that we have to live with. There's risk involved. We're going to have to live with whatever choice we take. We might try a new product. It might fail. But that's different than blame and externalization of responsibility. And that's what we're watching out for. Okay, we're also listening for characters. I know it's awkward to think of think of ourselves as characters in a story, because it can seem to trivialize our experience. But and As You Like It from Shakespeare, he said, all the world's a stage and all the men are merely players. Well, it's a little bit like that. He wrote the script, so he's actually deriving and controlling the story, but we actually have much more control over the story than Shakespeare alluded to. But it's important to understand characters in a story, how people are being described. So get your ears attuned when you're listening and to yourself and other people in your organization talk about what's going on, how people are being described. In unhealthier discursive narrative environments and unhealthier work environments, what you're going to hear is people being portrayed as either victims or victimizers. So for example, I could be making much more progress on this account if they didn't make us use this new stupid software system that's slowing us down, right? I'm victimized by an external software system that's been opposed by me. Then there's attribution of bad intention. That would be, for example, she gave me these plans knowing that they were incomplete, right? There's this idea of that there was malicious intent, or that somebody knew they were setting you up for failure. Or attributions of negative traits. That group just can't be trusted. That it can't be trusted, lack of competence, unwillingness to try, not having the skills, all of those kinds of things. In a healthier environment, what you're going to hear is people talking about the good and bad traits of people. She's really good at being on time, but she's not a visionary, or something like that. And that the intention is there. She really is trying to work hard. Or the marketing team really is trying to communicate better with the accounting team. So when you hear a mixed explanation of someone, not all good, not all evil, then you're in a healthier space, because that leaves room for more how we really are. It leaves room for somebody to regain their reputation if they've lost it in some way. It allows room for improvement, and it prevents the ostracizing people and shutting them out little by little, which eventually will lead to them either leaving the company or you ultimately letting them go, because they will be out of the whole. So that's very important. Moral values. Also, when people are talking about what's going on in an organization, when things are framed in black and white, then you're often in dangerous territory, versus things that are described in more multinodal ways. Okay, that's just fancy talk for saying one of the reasons that we get into conflict is we want multiple things at the same time. So in a business, one of the things we often want is things to be on time and have all the bells and whistles. It's hard to have both. How do you have everything be on time and not have all the bells and whistles? How do you have the top quality supplier for the lowest cost? How do you give the best customer service without spending hours on the phone? So in a healthy narrative environment, you're going to spend time deliberating different values versus saying, the accounting team just saying, but marketing just doesn't understand the kind of pressures that we're under, right? Because what it ends up happening is there's competing missions and values within an organization, and trying to get them all to match up at the same time is very challenging. But being able to hold multiple competing ideas is a sense of a healthy environment. One of the things just to talk about, when we talk about a healthy narrative space, we're not talking about consensus. We actually consider that very dangerous. If we walk into an environment and it sounds like everybody agrees, we know you're in big trouble, because that means that there are perspectives that aren't being voiced, either because people don't feel safe in voicing them, and I'll talk about in the next section, or because they're disregarded and so on. So those voices that aren't being heard are the things that are going to help save you against the competition, because you're going to have your challenging thoughts within the organization. So we're looking for places where people are debating, deliberating, reflecting, playing out different scenarios, understanding the complexity of things, and not shying away from complexity just to get a simple answer. So that's the gift of narrative, is that it's long-term. It can feel like it's slowing you down, but what it's slowing down is what Peter Senge talks about, is today's problems are yesterday's solutions. And that can happen when you're not really taking the time to think things through. So we're slowing you down, but in a good way. So the second part of our risk assessment is looking at power. This is something that's unique to the third generation of conflict resolution, where we're not just bringing parties together and mediating them. We're looking at how power operates in groups. And you know how power operates in groups, because organizations are very hierarchical. And what I was saying about in a space where it seems like there's consensus, that means that the dominant voice in the company, the dominant beliefs of the company, have marginalized or excluded other perspectives. So, for example, if the belief is that it's really important to stress that we're a multi-generation company, right? And that's what the company has always said and always believed, there might be a counter-narrative or a rebuttal to that, which is, actually, in today's market, I'm not even sure anybody really cares about that. Now, you might decide that's important or not important, but that's something that you'll want to discuss. And if those aren't actually brought into the conversation, if those challenging narratives are not brought in, the narratives themselves, the ideas, are going to retreat in silence. That's not what you want. The people may show up to the meeting, but you're losing the richness of the people you hired. You want those dissenting voices. There's a number of ways that they get pushed out. So they can be excluded. They're not allowed in that conversation. So that could be, for example, in a meeting when somebody says, well, I want to talk about the timeline of this. And the response to that might be, well, that's a different issue. We'll get to that later. And it gets tabled, and later means never. So that exclusion is a little bit of a problem. Then, and we all have had this experience, I'm sure, is you speak at a meeting, and it's like you never said anything. And the conversation goes on. That's an example of something being ignored. Or the worst, of course, is when someone else brings it up 5 minutes later, and then everybody applauds, and you're like, that was my idea. I said that minutes ago. Which is also that's also a power dynamic issue. When that starts to happen, there's certain people that can't be heard. The narrative can be heard, the perspective, but not the person. And then this really can decrease stakeholder engagement. If you can't let people air out, and contribute, you're going to miss your blind spots. That's why Jack Welch talked about, he would always ask himself throughout the day, what am I not seeing? And in our world, and from the narrative perspective, he's saying, what am I not hearing? What perspective am I not open to? It's a question he would ask himself all day. So that's what we're saying, kind of what perspective to ask yourselves throughout your day. What perspective am I not hearing? Who might have a dissenting opinion on this? What perspective might be excluded? And one of the nice things about a narrative approach is we're focused on the perspective, not the person. So there's exclusion of people, but there's exclusion of ideas. And we're looking at how ideas circulate, because that's how organizations are, right? They're the transfer of information and ideas. And one of the biggest problems in companies is communication, right? And feelings of transparency and trust and so on. And all of that gets enhanced when you start making room for marginalized ideas. Doesn't mean you have to spend hours on something that's brought up, but it needs to be heard. It needs to have a place in the room. So maybe you can always leave a chair open at a meeting for the unpopular opinion. That would be kind of a cute way to do it. And that way it doesn't get attributed to any one person. That the person can say, oh, I'm going to share the unpopular opinion today. Some people call that devil's advocate. So what happens if you don't do this? The risk of not including, it talks about the identities of the people start to be damaged. And that means they'll feel a lack of opportunity in the organization, and it starts to make them not think critically as much and disengage, which again, you're losing half the brain power and the engagement of your staff. And it's a lot less fun to work in that environment. Then part 3 of the risk assessment is we do a landscape assessment. We look at what we call the narrative ecology to see overall how are the different people being described? How are conflicts being discussed? How are challenges being discussed? How are the different values within the organization being negotiated? Being on time versus being high quality, great customer service versus hours on how to be time efficient and so on. How to find suppliers that you trust. So we're looking at that whole ecology together and finding areas of resilience. Then we engage. So when we do this, we do an assessment by doing, like I said, a listening tour. And in what I love so much about narrative is that actually in the listening tour, we're doing a lot of the work because different stories are coming out, and they're coming out to the air in an easy way. We engage with them, we legitimize areas that have been neglected for a while, and then we help anchor new storylines, new beliefs, new networks of communication that can help the organization be more resilient. So as I said, we like to legitimize the marginalized or the excluded voices, and which actually destabilizes some of the master narratives. So if there's a disbelief in the quality of the product, we can start to challenge that and say, well, in what ways is it still contributing, and so on. How do you intervene? What the heck is a narrative intervention in today's world? Well, we have a number of technologies that we use, and I can talk about these more later in other videos. Positive connotation, circular questions. I've done a video on this, externalization, one on that already, outsider witnessing, and reframing. So these are different discursive tools or tools that we use in dialogue to help to move out some of the destructive patterns and create spaces for something healthier to occur. Then after we do that, we like to do events with the whole organization or small groups. So we could take one team, 2 teams, 6 people. We do things called scenario building, which is looking at different scenarios, maybe for different product lines, different suppliers, different expansion of the company, different territories, and so on. We do something called a World Cafe, which hopefully you all have participated in if you're in a business, which is a different kind of circular conversation, which changes groups and creates a very interesting results. Companies like Hewlett-Packard have used it. The Mexican government has used it. Church groups have used it to think of ways to raise $500,000 in a year. So, and fishbowl interviews, which is a way to engage people from a distance and help you see problems a little bit farther away because they can feel so close. And we do this either in-house. We have retreats. We have a beautiful center called Point of View, but there's other places as well. Point of View is in Virginia, and then we also do it remotely. So thank you for your attention. This was just to whet your appetite and get you to start to think about your own organization like a TV show, and to think about it, or a drama, and think about whether you're hearing really soap opera kind of stories and descriptions of one another, or something that's more tragic, that really deals with the complexities of the world in which we find ourselves, the complexity of our personalities. You get away from these good, bad, right, wrong kinds of framings. So one of the just common mistakes that people make is when you walk into your organization and people say something like a belief about the organization, don't say, well, that's just your story. People don't tend to like that, because the things that are our stories, and I have experienced this personally, they don't feel like stories when they're yours. They feel like the absolute truth. So they really need to be handled delicately, which is what we're trained to do, which we love doing. But you can also do and be trained to do in your day-to-day is really contribute to a healthier narrative space in your organization by starting to add complexity. So if someone is presenting someone as all good or having negative intent, start to add back some of those other attributes. If some view at a meeting is not being included, make space for that. Invite it into the room. Help it along. And in doing so, and if everyone does that, that will increase engagement. Everybody really needs to take responsibility for this. Of course, the C-suite is going to set the tone, but an organization really is the result of all of its moving parts and patterns. Just moving a bad apple doesn't change a whole organization. It's really changing how people engage and think through problems together and feel like they matter and are brought into the conflict. There's enough to solve out there that you don't want to be wrapped up with all kinds of issues of distrust and transparency and competing values within your own organization. All right, that's enough for today. Thank you so much. I love talking about this stuff. You can see I have my email address up there, my website, languageofconflict.com, and you can also reach out to Sara Cobb, Dr. Sara Cobb. You can find her on the George Mason University website. So hope to hear from you. And